This video covers the evolution of American light tanks in World War II, starting with the M3 Stuart Tank, ending with the M22 airborne light tank. In between, we talk about the M3A1, M5, M5A1 Stuart Tanks, the M3 Satan Flamethrower Tank, and the M24 Chaffee tank. The M3 Stuart was developed in response to lessons learned about tank combat in the Spanish Civil War, beginning 1936, ending January 1939. In that war, the Spanish used Soviet T-26 tanks with 45mm main guns and German Panzer I tanks that by the end of the war were armed with 20mm guns. Our light tank at the time was the M2A2. That tank had front armor only 0.6 of 1 inch thick. That armor was completely inadequate for the guns mounted on tanks used in the Spanish Civil War. Just 1 month before the Spanish Civil War ended, December 1938, we came out with an upgrade, the M2A4. The main difference was the front armor was increased to 1 inch. Now, as you might imagine, this 1 inch still was inadequate, but at least it was improved, and when guns were fired from a greater distance, that armor had at least a better chance of holding up and defending the crew. A little more than 2 years later, it was April of 1941, we standardized the design of the tank we'd been working on all that time, the M3 Stuart. The main improvement of the M3 Stuart was we added an additional 1/2 inch of armor to the front of the tank to make it a full 1.5 inches. The tank became a 14-ton tank instead of a 12-ton tank. That's not free. With this extra 2 tons of weight, that required, in order to manage that weight and keep the flotation at an acceptable level, that required us to add an additional component to the track system. We added what's called a trailing idler. Prior to the M3 Stuart and the M2 series, the last component of this track system was the bogey wheels. The trailing idler had the effect of increasing the amount of track in touch with the ground, thereby reducing the pounds of pressure per square inch generated by the 14-ton tank. So you'll see this trailing idler on each side at the rear of the track system in the M3 Stuart. And if you're looking at photographs and you're wondering if you're looking at an M2 series or are you looking at an M3, look for whether there's a trailing idler. From the time we began production of the M3 Stuart in April of 1941 through the end of 1942, when we stopped producing M3 Stuarts, we manufactured more than 4,500 M3 Stuarts. We never froze the design, so during that entire 1.5 plus that we're manufacturing M3 Stuarts, we kept changing things along the way on the fly. So whenever I see an M3 Stuart, one of the first things I look for is clues to tell me, is this an early production version, a mid-production version, or a late production version? What I look at first in evaluating an M3 Stuart, I look at the turret. Every M3 Stuart has this commander's cupola. You see these direct vision slots in the commander's cupola, pretty crude method for the commander to be able to look out from that cupola. In early production versions of the M3 Stuart, these flat armored plates were connected with a combination of rivets and bolts. It was quickly determined that rivets and bolts did not hold up. So as time went on during the production of the M3 Stuart, we converted from rivets and bolts on the turret to welding the armored plates of the turret. And along the way, we had a combination of rivets connecting the front armor plate only, as you see here, with welds connecting the rest of the armor plate. So this would be conclusive that we're looking at a mid-production M3 Stuart. Another clue is to look at the sponson. So this segment of the hull on each side is called a sponson. And in the early production M3 Stuarts, the M3 Stuart was armed with fixed mount 30 caliber machine guns extending out on either side of the Stuart. As time went on, the Stuart Tank crews determined that you didn't get good bang for the buck. So the Stuart crews eliminated the 2 fixed machine guns, gaining storage space for ammunition or for whatever else. I don't know if these sponson gun mounts were welded closed in the factory or whether they were welded closed as a field modification. Both happened, but this would be another clue that this is a mid-production rather than an early production Stuart. Another characteristic here for every M3 Stuart is you see the angles of the armor. This is at a 90-degree angle, thereby limiting the value of the armor to the manufactured thickness of the armor. You'll see on later, as the light tanks evolved, we began to slope the armor, improving the protective capability of the armor without adding weight. But in the earliest versions here, we've got just right angles, vertical surfaces. One of the best features of every M3 Stuart was its power plant or engine. M3 Stuarts were powered by aircraft radial air-cooled engines, both a gasoline version and a diesel version. The gasoline version was manufactured by Continental. It was known as a W670. The diesel version was manufactured by Giberson and known as a T1020. These engines, either one, the gas or the diesel version, generated about 250 net horsepower and could help the tank gain speeds on flat surfaces of as high as 36 miles an hour. So the engines were very reliable, very robust, far better than the engines in British light tanks at the time. When the British got access to our early M3 Stuart tanks, they were so impressed with the engine, they gave the tank the nickname of Honey. Another significant feature of every M3 Stuart is the way that the armor in the hull was connected. It was connected always by rivets. As we talk about the evolution of the American light tank, you'll see we got away from rivets in our next generation, but the rivets themselves were a real Achilles heel of the tank. Machine gun rounds could drive these rivets right into the fighting chamber, putting the crew at significant risk. The M3 Stuart was crewed by 4 troops. Here you see the driver's position, you see the bow gunner's position, and in the turret there'd be 2 troops, both the tank commander, who did double duty as the loader for the gunner, and the gunners. The turret in the M3 Stuart did not have a basket. There was no turret basket. So just like you see here, it's just a deck. You've got 2 American troops that are standing on this deck. The turret itself traverses only manually, no power traverse. So as they're rotating the turret, they got to move around, getting in each other's way as they're working to load, working to aim, working to otherwise command the tank, but still an improvement over the M2 series of light tanks. The viewing system of the M3 Stuart was really primitive. Now, look at all I've got to look out as first I've got to manually close the hatch cover. That's all I can see. I don't have a periscope. I've just got a direct view through this narrow space. It's better than what we reviewed in a prior video about the M1917 light tank with a really skinny vision slot, but still it's just a direct vision slot. The hatch system for the M3 Stuart was pretty primitive as well. Look at the bow gunner's position. How do you think he's going to get out of there if the tank takes a hit? He's got the machine gun in front of him blocking his movement. A person just can't fit through a space that small. The only way the bow gunner can get out is by going up through the turret hatch. So all in all, the M3 Stuart would have been a really good tank for the Spanish Civil War in 1936 to 1939. But it was not a good tank for North Africa. It was under-armored and under-gunned. The M3 Stuart was a little more competitive in the Pacific theater of operations. Here, sitting next to our M3 Stuart, you see its Japanese counterpart. Now, this is not an authentic Japanese tank. This is a reproduction of a Type 95 Hago Japanese light tank, the most widely produced Japanese tank in World War II. And you can see it has a 37mm gun. They're about the same size. The armor is a little bit similar. It's not identical. But tank on tank, the M3 Stuart matched well against the Type 95 Hago. The first combat between the M3 Stuart and the Type 95 took place in the First Battle of the Philippines in December of 1941, and that battle was more or less a draw. But even though tank on tank, the M3 Stuart was competitive in the Pacific theater, it still wasn't well suited for for combat in the Pacific Theater. In the Pacific Theater, we were rarely fighting tank on tank. Mostly, we're using the M3 Stuart for infantry support in jungle conditions or to help take out enemy bunkers. And the 37mm gun on the M3 Stuart was not powerful enough to penetrate Japanese bunkers. And the second problem was, at 14 tons, the M3 Stuart was too light to effectively crush thick jungle and move through the jungle in combat conditions. So all in all, it left a lot to be desired. We got at it. We made a number of improvements with the next generation. Let's move on now to talk about the improvements we made in the M3A1 Stuart. Starting with the turret, the first thing you notice, and this was typical of every single M3A1 Stuart, there's no commander's cupola. So when you're looking at an M3 series of Stuart tank and you're wondering, is that an M3 or is that an M3A1? If there's a cupola, it's an M3. If there isn't a cupola, it's an M3A1. On the M3A1, we have a new and improved vision system. We have a 360-degree rotating periscope for the commander, and we have a periscope for the gunner as well. The turret has been modified. Instead of flat armor plates welded together, we have a flat armor plate only on the front. Welded now, there were none of these riveted. But the rest of the turret is curved cast armor, better than in the M3. The guns on the M3A1 were very similar to those on the M3. Same 37mm main gun. The only difference here was the M3A1 carried a total of 3 .30 caliber machine guns. A coaxial 30 caliber machine gun fixed mount, a ball mounted 30 caliber machine gun, and then the added turret mounted rear facing 30 caliber machine gun. You notice on this particular M3A1, as you look at the sponson, there's no opening, there's no machine gun mount. It's been manufactured without it. The machine gun mounts in the sponsons are now forever gone, beginning with the M3A1. Another big advantage of the M3A1 over the M3 is the armor on the hull was essentially welded. There's still some rivets for the deck on the hull, for example. It isn't going to take machine gun fire, but every surface on the M3A1 that was susceptible to enemy machine gun fire had welded armor instead of riveted armor. There are 3 major improvements inside the turret of the M3A1 over the M3. The first is you see a turret basket. So now the commander/loader and the gunner turn with the turret. They don't have to shuffle their feet. They don't have to worry about getting in each other's way. They don't have to worry about the orientation to the gun or the ready rack of rounds to put into the gun. And in addition to having a turret basket for the first time, this basket is now moved with a power traverse instead of manual traverse. So 2 big advantages. The third big advantage inside the turret here is the gun has a gyroscopic stabilizer to aid accurate shooting on the move. A big deal and a nice advantage over enemy armor. A disadvantage of this turret basket is the poor bow gunner. Remember in the M3, we're talking about the only way the bow gunner is going to get out of there is through the turret hatch. Well, when you put a basket in the way, this basket needs to be aligned exactly the way you see it here in order for the bow gunner to be able to get into it and then go out the turret hatch. If this basket is oriented differently, when it's time to bail as fast as you possibly can, bow gunner can't get out. Here you see a little different viewing system for the bow gunner and the driver. There's 2 vision slots, and one of the 2 vision slots can be covered up with a piece of armor. The engine and speed of the M3A1 was exactly the same as that of the M3. Still aircraft, radial, air-cooled engines, both a gasoline version and a diesel version, and still a top speed on level ground of about 36 miles an hour. We began manufacturing the M3A1 in 1942 and continued manufacturing it through the end of 1943. So there was a period of time where we're manufacturing both M3 Stuarts and M3A1s. We manufactured slightly more M3A1s than we did the M3, Altogether, in 1942 and 1943, we manufactured a little more than 4,600 M3A1 Stuarts. So now let's move on to talk about the next step in the evolution of American light tanks in World War II. Now, the next iteration was the M5 Stuart. I don't have an M5 Stuart. What we have here is an M5A1. During World War II, we manufactured only about 2,000 M5 Stuarts. We manufactured more than 7,000 M5A1 Stuarts, but they're substantially the same. The biggest difference in the M5 series of light tanks was the engine. While we're manufacturing the M3 Stuart and the M3A1, we manufactured more than 9,000 of them, but the problem was we didn't have enough aircraft radial engines available to allocate to tanks. So the engine in the M5 is a water-cooled dual 8-cylinder Cadillac engines connected together to generate about 220 net horsepower, a little bit less than generated by the aircraft radial engines, but still able to propel the M5 series of tanks at about the same speed, 36 miles an hour on flat ground. In order to fit the Cadillac water-cooled engine into the M5, we had to modify the rear hull. If you come with me here, you'll see on the M5, and this is on every M5, whether it's an M5 or an M5A1, you see an elevation to the rear hull. This was essential to make room to accommodate the cooling system resting on top of the Cadillac engine. From a distance, that's what I always look for with a Stuart series of tanks, and I'm wondering, is that an M3 series or is that an M5 series? If the back hull is flat, it's an M3 series. If the back hull is elevated, it's an M5 series. Now let's move around to the front of the hull and look at some of the other new developments in the M5 series that are found both in the M5 and in the M5A1. Now here, for the first time, you see sloped front armor. Huge innovation. This is a 48-degree slope on the front armor, and on the side armor here, we have a 20-degree slope. And so without adding actual thickness to the armor, we have effectively created more armor for enemy rounds to have to penetrate to get inside the fighting chamber of the tank. So everything welded throughout the M5 series. Another advantage of sloped front armor is we got 2-for-1s here in advantage. By extending the bottom of the front armor plate more forward and expanding the size then of the entire hull, we created room for hatches with M6 periscopes, both for the driver and for the bow gunner. We have the same 37 millimeter gun. We have a coaxial 30 caliber machine gun fixed. We have a ball mounted bow gun, 30 caliber machine gun, and then we have an anti-aircraft gun on the side of the turret. Now let's talk about what's different on this M5A1 in comparison with the original M5. The turret of the M5A1 has a turret that is extended further toward the rear with what's called a bustle. And the function of this bustle is to create a compartment to put a radio. That's the first big deal here in relation to the M5A1. You've got a radio compartment. Subtle, but important. The second difference between the M5A1 and the M3 is the location of the anti-aircraft 30 caliber machine gun. On the M5 version, the 30 caliber machine gun was still mounted on the rear of the turret. But when the turret was modified to create a radio compartment, the 30 caliber machine gun was moved around to the side. Now this is really a better position, a better firing position to be able to fire forward as well as backward as well as to the side. You really have a lot better field of fire altogether. And then along with moving the anti-aircraft 30 caliber machine gun to the side of the turret, we added in late production M5A1s, we added an armored casing to store the 30 caliber machine gun when needed. One more feature I want to point out on the M5 series of tanks, it's really not a big deal functionally, but I'm fascinated by it and want to point it out to you. For some reason, on the M5 series, we added two 2-inch peepholes in the front of the hull. So I just find that fascinating, number one. Number two, we have armored plugs that you can position over the peepholes from inside the hull. So I just get a kick out of that, and I wanted to share it with you. That really covers the M5 series of tanks. Now, I find it interesting that we were manufacturing M3 Stuarts, M3A1 Stuarts, and M5 Stuarts all at the same time in 1942. Now we'll move on to the last and best light tank the United States manufactured during World War II, the M24 Chaffee. Now just look at this and contrast it with the original M3. Here we are in 1944, and look how far American light tanks have come. From a functional perspective, the major difference is the gun. Here we've got a 75mm main gun. We could put the same 75mm gun that you find on other American armor in the Chaffee, but that made the Chaffee too heavy, beyond the weight limit for a light tank. So getting a gun that had this firepower, this punch, these ballistics, but was light enough and compact enough to be managed by a turret limited to this size, we finally solved it by taking an aircraft version of a 75mm gun. It was the gun that was mounted in the Mitchell B-25 bomber. Thinner gun tube, that means it's going to wear out quicker, but for a tank, that didn't matter. We don't have a problem replacing the gun when it wears out. So thinner, and then the other thing is it has concentric recoil so that it would fit in a hull this size. By the time we get to the size of the M5 series with a larger hull than the M3 series, the weight of the M5 series increased from 14 tons to 16 tons. Now we have obviously a far larger hull here, but we only increased the weight 4 additional tons. This is a 20-ton tank. And we actually thinned the armor. This has only 1-inch thick front armor, thinner than on the M3 series. But with the slope, the value of the trade-off to have the punch of this gun on a platform this light made it worth it. Another major improvement in the M24 Chaffee over the prior Stuart series of light tanks is a brand new suspension system. So first, let's look at the suspension system, the so-called vertical spring volute suspension system that was found on the M3 series and the M5 series. There's a spring that extends vertically into these 2 bogie wheels. This was the state of the art for a number of variants of American tank. On the M24 Chaffee, we went to an entirely new, innovative suspension system, a so-called torsion bar suspension system. So look what we've got here now. The view of the tracks and the wheels, entirely different from what we saw on the Stuart series. Here now we've got dual road wheels, twin road wheels. We have a center guide on this track. The tracks on the M24 Chaffee are actually quite a bit wider than the tracks on the Stuart series of tanks. So all of this contributed to better cross-country mobility with the M24 Chaffee, powered by the same engine found in the M5 series, the twin 8-cylinder water-cooled Cadillac engine, generating a speed as high as 35 miles an hour on a flat, hard surface. The M24 Chaffee was the best light tank of World War II. We manufactured slightly more than 4,700 of them. Not only did we use these through the end of World War II, we used them in the Korean War, and the French used our M24 Chafees in the French Indochina War in Vietnam. So now let's talk about 2 real specialty American light tanks of World War II, the M3 Satan Flamethrower Tank and the M22 airborne light tank. First, the M3 Satan Flamethrower Tank. You won't see another one of these. We converted only 24 M3 series Stuart tanks to Satan Flamethrower tanks for the Marine Corps in 1944. In the Pacific theater of operations against the Japanese, flamethrowers were a major weapon system for the Marine Corps in particular, also for Army operations in the Pacific. The Japanese tactics included a lot of underground positions, positions in caves, positions in bunkers, and flames from a flamethrower weapon could go anywhere if you got close enough. The man-portable flamethrower was very effective, taking out underground, well-fortified Japanese positions. But the major limitation of the man-portable flamethrower is it could only shoot its flame about 20 yards. The flamethrower operator had no protection from enemy fire. He had to get that close. I've seen reports indicating that the average life expectancy for the operator of a portable flamethrower in combat in the Pacific theater of operations was only 4 minutes. So good weapon system, but very high casualty rate. One of our big innovations then was to say, hey, let's take a tank, an otherwise obsolete tank, and convert it into a flamethrower platform. So we did that for the first time for the Marines to use in the Battle of Saipan and the Battle of Tinian. What you see here is, it started out as an M3 series Stuart tank. The main gun was removed and replaced with a mount where the crew could position a British flamethrower weapon. The major advantage over man-portable is the Satan could shoot its flame out 60 to 80 yards. Another major improvement is the man-portable system is limited to the tanks of napalm, other fuel, on the back of the operator, but we could put a 170-gallon tank inside the M3 tank to maintain combat operations far longer than was the case with a man-portable system. After the Battle of Tinian, we converted tank-based flamethrowers to the Sherman tank platform. So after Tinian, those 24 M3 Satan tanks saw no further combat. Something that is interesting to me about our particular Satan tank is when you read the literature, you see that we converted all M3A1 tanks to become Satan flamethrowers. But look at this, we've got a cupola on top. This is an M3. Is this early, mid, or late production? This is definitely a very late production M3. I'm wondering if this got lost in the history books, that there was at least one M3 converted into a Satan along with other M3A1s. We know this is a very late model because all of the armor is welded. The convention is that we began welding the armor on the M3A1 series, but you can see in the literature that some very late production M3s also began to have welded armor instead of riveted armor. So that's what we have here. Very rare, maybe one of a kind. Now we wrap up with the M22 airborne light tank. So as you can see, this is a bare bones tank, but it's not bare bones because it was early in World War II. This actually is a late World War II production. And what this was designed to do was to support paratrooper operations. This tank weighs only 7 tons. It was designed to be carried either in a certain type of transport aircraft or in a certain type of glider to be delivered to the battlefield along with paratroopers. We manufactured only 280 of these. What's most remarkable about this particular tank is just how rare it is. Of the 280 that we manufactured, our research shows that fewer than 20 remain today. This has to be one of the best examples of the M22 airborne tank. I've seen photographs of a number of the surviving tanks. Some of them are missing their turret. Some of them don't have a main gun. Some of them haven't been restored, but this is complete, restored, original, and pristine example of the M22 light tank. The United States never took this into combat. The British, however, did in one operation, Operation Varsity, where the British were fighting to cross the Rhine River. A number of the M22 Locusts crash-landed and were lost in the crash. Of the few units that got to the front line in Operation Varsity, they really were not helpful to the British. What they were an attractant for German artillery fire, and the British paratroopers told the tankers, get out of here. You're drawing artillery fire. So really no impact on the outcome of World War II, but the origin of airborne light tanks carried through with our M551 Sheridan airborne light tank in the Vietnam War. That covers the evolution of American World War II light tanks that we have here in the museum. Please add your comments, corrections, additions to what I've presented, and please visit when you can to help us honor the history of American freedom.